They thought he was dying, but the cameras captured something no one could explain. For 9 straight days, the massive silverback gorilla named Koba hadn't touched a single bite of food, not his favorite fruits, not the fresh vegetables carefully prepared by the staff, not even the high-calorie nutrition supplements designed to keep him alive in critical situations. And in a place where a fully grown gorilla could weigh over 400 pounds and required a carefully monitored daily diet. This wasn't just unusual. It was terrifying, because every passing hour without food pushed his body closer to a point of no return. Yet what unsettled the veterinary team even more wasn't just his refusal to eat. It was what he had been doing before everything changed. Because just days earlier, security footage from inside the enclosure showed Koba behaving in a way none of the staff had ever seen before. Every night, at almost the exact same time, he would slowly walk to the thick glass barrier facing the service corridor, raise his enormous hand, and gently tap against the surface. Not aggressively, not out of frustration, but with a strange, deliberate rhythm, as if he was trying to signal something or someone on the other side. And then he would sit there, completely still, his dark eyes fixed on the empty hallway beyond the glass, waiting, watching, for minutes at a time, sometimes nearly an hour, until eventually he would lower his head and return to the corner of his habitat, repeating the same behavior again the next night, and then again the night after that, until, suddenly, without warning, he stopped eating altogether, and by day 3, his movement slowed. By day 6, he barely stood, and by day 9, he lay curled against the enclosure wall, his breathing shallow, his once powerful frame now eerily still, while visitors whispered from a distance and staff members exchanged worried glances, unsure if they were witnessing the final days of one of the most intelligent animals they had ever cared for, because nothing in his medical tests pointed to a clear cause, no infection, no visible injury, no signs of disease that could explain such a rapid decline. And yet the pattern in the footage kept replaying in the minds of those who had seen it. That quiet tapping, that patient waiting, that unwavering gaze directed at a place where no one had been standing, as if Koba wasn't simply shutting down, but reacting to something that no one else could see, something that had started before the hunger strike, something that turned a healthy, alert gorilla into a silent, unmoving figure in less than 10 days. And as the clock kept ticking and his strength continued to fade, one question hung heavily over everyone involved, a question no one could answer yet. Who, or what, had Koba been waiting for by the time the sun rose over the zoo that morning? A quiet tension had already settled across the staff, the kind that did not come from panic, but from the slow realization that something was deeply wrong, because Koba had not moved from his spot near the enclosure wall for hours. And when the first keeper approached with a tray of sliced apples, leafy greens, and protein biscuits, the silverback did not even lift his head, which immediately triggered a series of internal alerts, since a gorilla of his size could not safely go more than a few days without proper nutrition. And now they were well past that window. So Dr. Emily Carter was called in early, reviewing his charts while standing just outside the enclosure, her eyes shifting between the data on her tablet and the unmoving figure inside. And what troubled her most was not just the lack of eating, but the absence of engagement, because Koba was known for his awareness, his responsiveness, his ability to track movement and interact even subtly with the people around him. Yet now he seemed disconnected, not aggressive, not distressed in the usual sense, just withdrawn in a way that felt intentional, as if he had chosen to step away from everything. And when she instructed the team to begin a full medical evaluation, they carefully administered fluids and ran non-invasive checks, monitoring his temperature, his heart rate, and his hydration levels, all of which showed signs of decline, but not a clear cause. No infection markers, no obvious internal distress, nothing that explained why a healthy gorilla would suddenly refuse to sustain himself. And as the hours passed, the staff rotated in and out, each one trying their own method to prompt a response, calling his name, placing food closer, even introducing enrichment items that he usually enjoyed. But nothing broke through that silent barrier he had placed between himself and the world. And it was during one of these quiet observation periods that a younger keeper named Lucas mentioned something that shifted the conversation. He said he had reviewed more of the camera footage from the previous week and noticed that Koba was not just tapping on the glass randomly. He was doing it at the same time every night, almost to the minute, around 9:15, and always facing the same direction, toward the service corridor that had not been used regularly in years, which prompted Dr. Carter to request a full review of the recordings. And as they watched the footage together, the pattern became undeniable. Koba would approach the glass with purpose, raise his hand slowly, tap 3 times, pause, and then remain there, completely still, his gaze fixed beyond the barrier, not scanning, not reacting to passing staff, but focused, waiting, as if expecting someone to appear, and the more they watched, the more unsettling it became, because there was nothing there, no scheduled activity, no personnel assigned to that corridor at that hour, just an empty stretch of concrete and closed doors. Yet Koba returned to that exact spot night after night, repeating the same sequence, and then, almost immediately after the last recorded night of that behavior, he stopped eating entirely, and the room fell quiet as the footage ended, because what they were seeing did not match any standard behavioral explanation. It did not fit illness. It did not fit stress from environmental changes. It felt like something else entirely, something tied to memory or expectation. And as Dr. Carter stood there replaying the final clip, she could not shake the feeling that Koba was not giving up. He was waiting, and whatever or whoever he had been waiting for had not shown up, at least not yet. As the investigation continued, the atmosphere inside the observation room shifted from concern to something closer to unease, because the more they studied Koba's behavior, the less it resembled any known medical or environmental issue, and Dr. Emily Carter began to consider possibilities that went beyond standard veterinary explanations, carefully reviewing not only his recent health records, but also his long-term history at the facility, going back years to when he first arrived, and what she found added another layer to the mystery. Because Koba had not always been this withdrawn or detached. In fact, he had once been one of the most socially responsive gorillas in the entire enclosure, known for recognizing individual keepers, responding to familiar voices, and even displaying subtle gestures that suggested a deep level of memory and emotional awareness, which made his current state feel even more unnatural, as if something fundamental had been disrupted. And it was during this deeper review that a name surfaced again, not from the recent reports, but from older logs that had not been referenced in years, a name that appeared repeatedly in connection with Koba's early behavioral development. A former senior keeper who had spent an unusual amount of time working directly with him during his formative years, someone who had been noted for building a strong bond with the animal. And although the records were clinical in tone, there were small comments scattered throughout that hinted at something more personal. Notes about Koba calming down when this person was present, responding more quickly to cues, even refusing to engage with others when that individual was absent. And as Dr. Carter read through these entries, she paused, recognizing a pattern that seemed to echo what they were witnessing now, except in reverse, because back then, Koba had thrived in that connection, and now he appeared to be fading without it. And when she brought this up with the team, Lucas immediately leaned forward, recalling that he had heard older staff mention a keeper who used to work closely with Koba, but had left abruptly years ago, though no one seemed to know the full story. And as they searched further into archived schedules and personnel files, they finally confirmed the identity, Daniel Brooks, a name that had not been spoken in the facility for nearly a decade. And yet suddenly it felt central to everything unfolding. Because when they cross-referenced the timeline of Koba's recent behavioral changes with the facility's internal updates, they discovered something that made everyone in the room go quiet. Just over a week before Koba began tapping on the glass and refusing food, there had been a routine maintenance notice involving the old service corridor, the very same corridor Koba had been facing each night, a corridor that had once been used frequently during the period when Daniel Brooks was still working at the zoo. And although it had been largely inactive for years, the maintenance work had temporarily reopened access points and triggered faint sounds and movements in that area. Sounds that might not have meant anything to the staff, but to an animal with a memory like Koba's, it could have been enough to awaken something long dormant. And suddenly the pieces began to align in a way that was both astonishing and deeply unsettling, because it suggested that Koba's behavior was not random, not a symptom of illness, but a response to a memory that had been triggered by subtle environmental changes, a memory tied to a specific person. And as the realization settled in, The question shifted from what was wrong with Koba to whether the one person he might still be waiting for even knew what was happening. The idea that a memory could be strong enough to cause a full-grown gorilla to stop eating should have sounded unlikely, even impossible, and yet everything they were seeing pointed in that direction. But not everyone on the team was convinced, because from a clinical standpoint, the situation was becoming critical, and hesitation could cost Koba his life. So later that afternoon, a meeting was called inside the small conference room overlooking the enclosure, where Dr. Emily Carter stood at the front with her notes while the rest of the staff gathered, their expressions tense and divided, and she carefully explained the pattern they had uncovered, the timing of the tapping, the connection to the reopened corridor, and the historical bond with Daniel Brooks, laying out the theory that Koba's behavior might be linked to a triggered memory rather than a physical illness. But as soon as she finished, one of the senior supervisors leaned forward and shook his head, pointing out that regardless of the cause, the gorilla had not eaten in over a week and was already showing signs of severe weakness, emphasizing that waiting for a speculative emotional explanation could be dangerous and suggesting immediate intervention, including sedation and assisted feeding, measures that could stabilize Koba physically but would also interrupt whatever internal process he was going through. And the room fell into a quiet debate, because both sides had valid concerns. On one hand, the urgency of preserving his health, and on the other, the possibility that forcing intervention could break the only connection that might bring him back. And as the discussion continued, Dr. Carter found herself looking through the glass toward the enclosure, where Koba remained in the same position, his large body still, his head slightly turned toward the direction of the corridor, even now, as if part of him was still focused on that space. And something about that detail made her hesitate, because it did not look like resignation, it looked like expectation, and she spoke again, this time more firmly, suggesting a narrow window of time, just one more day before any invasive procedures were considered, a final chance to test the theory. And although the decision was not unanimous, the team agreed to wait. But that left them with a new challenge: how to reach someone who had been gone for nearly 10 years, because Daniel Brooks was no longer listed in any current system, his contact information outdated, his employment file closed. And as the staff began searching through old records and reaching out to former employees, the sense of urgency only grew, because every hour mattered now. And as evening approached, Lucas managed to track down a lead through a retired staff member who remembered that Daniel had moved out of state, possibly to a small town several hundred miles away. And while they attempted to make contact, leaving messages and sending emails with no immediate response, time continued to slip away. And back in the enclosure, as the lights dimmed and the zoo prepared to close for the night, the cameras once again captured Koba slowly rising from his resting position, his movements weaker than before, but still deliberate, as he made his way to the glass, raised his hand, and tapped 3 times, then paused, his eyes fixed on the empty corridor, waiting, just as he had every night before. And for those watching the live feed, the silence that followed felt heavier than ever, because now they understood what that moment might mean. And yet the one person who could answer it was still nowhere to be found. The night stretched on with a quiet urgency that no one could ignore, and by early morning, the situation had reached a point where even the most patient members of the team were beginning to question whether waiting any longer was a risk they could afford, because Koba's condition had not improved, and if anything, his movements had become slower, more fragile, as though every step required effort. And when Dr. Emily Carter reviewed his vitals again, she could see the numbers slipping further from safe levels, not catastrophically, but steadily, in a way that signaled time was running out. And yet despite all of that, there was still something in his behavior that refused to align with the idea of simple physical decline, because even in his weakened state, Koba had continued his nightly ritual without fail, rising with the same deliberate intent, making his way to the glass, and tapping those same 3 times before waiting in silence, as if that action mattered more to him than anything else. And it was this consistency that kept Dr. Carter from calling for immediate intervention, even as pressure from the administration increased, urging her to move forward with sedation and nutritional support. But before any final decision could be made, a small but critical breakthrough occurred, because just after sunrise, Lucas rushed into the observation room holding his phone, his voice tight with urgency as he explained that one of the messages they had sent the night before had finally been returned, not directly, but through a relative of Daniel Brooks who had recognized the name and forwarded the request. And according to the message, Daniel was currently traveling several hours away with limited access to his phone, but he had seen the email and was trying to call back. And for the first time in days, the room filled with a cautious sense of hope, because it meant that the one person they had been searching for was now aware of what was happening. And as they waited for the call to come through, every minute seemed to stretch longer than the last, until finally the phone rang, and Lucas answered immediately, placing it on speaker so that everyone could hear. And on the other end, a calm but slightly confused voice introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, asking what was going on. And when Dr. Carter began to explain, carefully describing Koba's condition, his refusal to eat, and the strange behavior with the glass, there was a brief silence on the line, followed by a shift in Daniel's tone, something quieter, more focused, as if he was processing not just the information but the meaning behind it. And when she mentioned the tapping, the timing, and the direction Koba was facing, Daniel did not ask for clarification. He did not question the details. Instead, he spoke in a low, steady voice and said that Koba used to do something similar years ago, but only under very specific circumstances. And as the staff leaned closer, listening intently, Daniel explained that during his time at the zoo, there had been a routine he followed every evening, entering through that exact corridor around the same time, stopping briefly before stepping into view, and tapping on the glass in a simple pattern before greeting Koba, a habit that had started as a way to signal his arrival and had eventually become something Koba seemed to recognize, something he would wait for. And as the realization spread across the room, the weight of what they were witnessing became undeniable, because it meant that Koba was not just remembering Daniel, he was repeating a shared ritual, expecting it to be answered. And when Dr. Carter asked if he could come, if he could return even for a short time, there was no hesitation in Daniel's response. He simply said he would leave immediately, calculating the distance and estimating that he could arrive by late afternoon if traffic allowed. And as the call ended, the team exchanged silent looks, because now everything depended on whether they had reached him in time. And back in the enclosure, Koba remained where he had been, his body still weak, but his head turned slightly toward the corridor, as if holding onto the last thread of something only he could feel, waiting for a response that, for the first time in days, might finally come. The hours that followed moved with a strange mix of urgency and stillness, as if time itself was being stretched between two outcomes no one could fully control. And throughout the late morning and into the early afternoon, every member of the staff found themselves checking the same two things over and over again: Koba's condition and the clock, because while Daniel Brooks was now on his way, the distance between them still felt enormous, and there was no guarantee that Koba could hold on long enough for that reunion to happen. And inside the enclosure, the massive silverback remained largely motionless, his breathing slow but steady, his body conserving what little energy it had left. Yet even in that weakened state, there were moments that caught the attention of those watching closely: small movements that did not align with complete shutdown, a slight lift of his head when distant sounds echoed from the service side of the building, a faint shift in posture whenever footsteps passed near the corridor he had been focused on for days, as if some part of him was still alert, still listening, still waiting. And Dr. Emily Carter stayed nearby for most of that time, monitoring him closely, adjusting his fluid support just enough to keep him stable without interfering too heavily, carefully balancing the need to preserve his strength with the decision they had made to avoid more aggressive intervention. And as the afternoon wore on, the tension in the air became more noticeable, because every hour that passed reduced the margin for error. And by mid-afternoon, word came through that Daniel had crossed into the city limits, still driving, still hours into a journey he had not planned but did not hesitate to make. And as that update spread quietly among the staff, something shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in the subtle energy of the room, a sense that they were approaching a moment that would either confirm everything they believed or force them to confront the possibility that they were wrong. And back in the enclosure, as the sun began to lower and cast long shadows across the habitat, Koba made a movement that immediately drew attention, because for the first time since early that morning, He began to push himself upward, slowly, with visible effort, his large frame rising inch by inch until he reached a seated position, his head turning once again toward the familiar direction of the corridor. And though his strength was clearly diminished, there was a focus in his gaze that had not been there before, something sharper, more present, and the staff watching the live feed leaned in closer, sensing that something was about to change. And then, with a deliberate motion that mirrored the footage they had studied so many times, Koba lifted his hand and tapped against the glass. Once, twice, 3 times, the sound soft but unmistakable in the quiet space. And then he held still, his eyes fixed forward, waiting, and in that moment, the entire situation seemed to narrow down to a single point of anticipation, because somewhere just a few miles away, the person he had been waiting for was getting closer with every passing minute. And for the first time since this began, it felt as though the answer to everything was no longer hidden. It was on its way by the time the call finally came through from the front gate. The entire team was already watching the live feed, as if they could feel that something was about to happen, and when the message confirmed that Daniel Brooks had just arrived and was being escorted through the staff entrance, a quiet ripple moved through the room, not excitement, but something deeper, a kind of held breath that no one seemed willing to release yet, because everything they had believed, everything they had waited for, now depended on what would happen in the next few minutes. And as Daniel moved quickly through the service corridors, guided by a staff member who had only heard the story but had not witnessed any of it, his expression shifted from confusion to something more serious with each step, because even before he reached the enclosure, he could sense the tension in the building, the unusual stillness, the way conversations hushed as he passed. And when they finally brought him to the observation area, Dr. Emily Carter met him there, offering only a brief explanation before stepping aside and allowing him to see for himself. And for a moment, Daniel said nothing, his eyes fixed on the figure inside the enclosure, taking in the sight of Koba, thinner, slower, but unmistakably the same gorilla he had once known. And there was a pause, not long, but heavy, as if both time and distance had suddenly collapsed into that single moment. And then, without hesitation, Daniel asked to go to the corridor, not the main viewing area, not the public side, but the exact place where the cameras had shown Koba standing each night. And although there were protocols to consider, no one argued, because at this point, they all understood that this was not a standard situation. And as Daniel walked down the familiar hallway, his steps slowed slightly, not out of uncertainty, but recognition. Because this was a path he had taken countless times before, years ago, during a routine that had once meant nothing more than the start of another shift, and now carried a weight none of them had anticipated. And when he reached the spot just beyond the glass, he stopped, standing still for a moment, as if allowing the silence to settle. And inside the enclosure, Koba remained seated, his body weak but upright, his gaze already fixed in that direction, as though he had sensed the change before anyone else. And the room watching from the monitors seemed to fade into the background as Daniel slowly raised his hand, placing it gently against the glass, not speaking yet, not rushing the moment, just recreating the first part of a pattern that had not been completed in nearly 10 years. And then, with a steady motion, he tapped once, paused, tapped a second time, paused again, and then tapped a third time. The same rhythm, the same signal, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, just a quiet stillness that stretched longer than anyone expected, until suddenly, Koba's posture shifted, not dramatically, but unmistakably, his head lifting higher, his eyes widening with a clarity that had been absent for days. And then, with a slow but deliberate movement, he began to rise, his large frame pushing upward as if responding to something deeply familiar, something that had finally returned. And as he took his first step toward the glass, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, because in that moment, it was no longer a theory, it was happening, right in front of them the moment Koba took that first step forward. Something shifted in a way that no chart or data could ever fully explain. Because just minutes earlier he had struggled to even hold himself upright, and now, despite the weakness still visible in every movement, there was a clear sense of purpose guiding him across the enclosure, his eyes locked on the figure standing beyond the glass. And as he moved closer, the distance between them seemed to dissolve years of absence into something immediate and real. and Daniel remained exactly where he was, his hand still resting gently against the barrier, not moving, not speaking yet, allowing Koba to come to him in his own time. And when the gorilla finally reached the glass, he stopped just inches away, his massive frame rising to its full height as much as his strength would allow. And for a brief second, he simply stared, his gaze fixed on Daniel's face with an intensity that held the entire room in silence, as if he was confirming something that could not be measured, something that went beyond recognition. And then, slowly, Koba lifted his hand, mirroring the position on the other side, placing it against the glass directly opposite Daniel's, the two separated only by the transparent barrier. And in that contact, however indirect, there was a connection that had clearly never been broken, only paused by time and distance. And those watching from the monitors could see the change unfold in real time, because the stillness that had defined Koba for days began to fade, replaced by subtle but undeniable signs of awareness, his posture becoming more stable, his breathing more controlled, his eyes no longer distant but focused and present. And Daniel finally spoke, his voice low and steady, using the same tone he had used years before, the same simple greeting that had once marked the start of countless routines. And though the words themselves were not complex, the effect was immediate, because Koba responded not with sudden movement, but with a soft, deliberate shift, leaning slightly closer, his expression easing in a way that suggested recognition not just of the voice, but of the presence behind it. And for several long moments, nothing else happened. No dramatic gestures, no sudden changes, just a quiet exchange that carried more weight than anything else could have. And then, almost as if guided by that connection, Koba lowered himself slowly, not collapsing as he had before, but settling into a more stable position near the glass, his body no longer withdrawn but oriented toward Daniel. And it was in that moment that Dr. Emily Carter noticed something she had been hoping to see, a subtle but critical shift in Koba's behavior. Because when one of the keepers carefully placed a small portion of food nearby, closer than before, but still within his reach, Koba's attention flickered toward it for the first time in days, not fully engaging yet, but acknowledging its presence. And that single moment, that brief glance, was enough to send a quiet wave of relief through the room, because it meant that something had changed, something essential. And as Daniel remained there, continuing to speak in calm, familiar tones, maintaining that connection without forcing it, the tension that had built over the past 9 days began to ease, replaced by a cautious but growing sense that they were witnessing not just a reaction, but the beginning of a return. As the minutes passed, what had started as a fragile moment of recognition slowly grew into something far more profound, because Koba did not turn away from the glass. He did not retreat back into the silence that had held him for days. Instead, he remained there, grounded, present, his focus anchored entirely on Daniel. And the change was no longer subtle. It was visible in the way he held himself, in the steadiness of his breathing, in the quiet alertness that had replaced the distant emptiness in his eyes. And for the first time since this began, the staff watching from the monitors allowed themselves to believe that this was not temporary, that this was real. And as Daniel continued speaking in that same calm, familiar tone, occasionally repeating simple phrases from years ago, something remarkable began to happen, because Koba shifted his attention once more toward the small portion of food that had been placed nearby. And this time he did not just glance at it, he reached for it, slowly, carefully, as if testing whether the moment was still there, whether the connection remained. And when his hand closed around the food and he brought it closer, the entire room seemed to freeze again, not in fear, but in anticipation, because this was the turning point they had been waiting for. And when Koba finally took that first bite, it was not dramatic, it was not rushed, it was simple, deliberate, and unmistakable. And the effect was immediate. A quiet wave of relief moving through the staff, some of them exhaling for what felt like the first time in hours, others watching in silence as the reality of what they were witnessing settled in. Because this was not just a recovery, it was a response, a direct answer to something that could not be measured by tests or explained by charts. And as Koba continued to eat, slowly regaining a part of himself that had seemed lost, Daniel remained there, not stepping away, not breaking the connection, understanding without needing to be told that his presence was not just helpful, It was essential. And over the next hour, the change became even more clear. Koba's movements grew steadier, his posture more natural, his awareness extending beyond the single point of focus at the glass, yet always returning to it, as if ensuring that the connection remained intact. And later, as the immediate crisis passed, and the staff began to plan the next steps for his recovery, one truth stood out above everything else, something that no one in that room would forget, because what they